So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Radim Žák. I am the regional coordinator for Eastern Europe and Central Asia at ICMPD. It is 28th of May, shortly after 10:30 Vienna time. And on behalf of the Prague Process Secretariat at ICMPD, I would like to welcome you to the third Prague Process webinar. The first webinar with the title, The Possible Impact of COVID-19 on the EU's Demand for High-Skilled Migrants with Mr. Glenn Hodgson, took place on the 16th of April. The second webinar, The Impact of the Corona Crisis on Migration with Professor Rainer Münz, took place on the 15th of May. With today's presenters and the Executive Director of the NGO Europe Without Barriers, Ms. Irina Sushko, we discussed our potential cooperation in Kiev at the beginning of February 2020, considering what the focus of the cooperation could be. In slightly more than a month, the focus became rather obvious. The title of the webinar today is The Impact of COVID-19 on Ukrainian labor migrants in the European Union. Each of the webinars is also accompanied by publication of a related policy brief, which is available in English and Russian and distributed via email and the Prague Process website. This webinar is not an exception. Outside of this scope, I would also like to bring to your attention the ICMPD publication of the background note, Migration and Mobility in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, What to Expect in Time of COVID-19, which was published at the beginning of this month. Before we start, I would like to thank my colleagues from the Prague Process team for organizing this webinar, Mr. Alexander Maleyev, the project manager, Ms. Irina Lyusak, the project officer, and Julia Sobotska, project assistant. To conclude my opening intervention, I have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Ruslan Minic and Mr. Pavlo Kravchuk, both being experts in migration and border management, as well as EU integration of the non-governmental organization Europe Without Barriers, which is based in Ukraine. After the presentation by Ruslan and Pavlo, we will continue with the questions and answers session that will be facilitated by Irina Lyusak. Please feel free to raise your questions already during the presentation in writing using the chat function. Last but not least, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available online after editing. Having said this, I would like to hand over to our experts, the presenters. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. So I would like to start, and let me first show the presentation so it will be easier to follow. Just a moment. Okay. So I would like to briefly outline what we are going to talk today. And first of all, well, everything will be about the impact of COVID-19 and the respective measures, lockdowns in EU countries and Prague Process countries on the labor migrants. And when everything started, the situation, the developments were very fast moving, changing, and the first issue that concerned the labor migrants was the return options, because for some reasons, some migrants wanted to go back home to renew the documents. For some cases, the documents expired. So the second issue we're going to discuss is also the legalization of stay of those people whose documents expire or visa-free expired the number of days. Of course, we're going to talk also about the labor migrants developments, because this is the main reason why migrants come to the host country to earn money. And of course, the COVID-19, as everybody knows, some economy sectors were in disaster, some economic sectors were vice versa flourishing. And of course, these changes could not but affect the labor migrants. We're gonna talk about two special cases, the Ukrainian domestic workers in Italy and seasonal workers in Poland, just because they are so important for three countries, Italy, Poland, and Ukraine. And at the end, we're going to talk also about the importance of effective communication, because the situation, as I said, developed very quickly, and it was important for people to understand their rights, their opportunities, their choices, what should they do to make the rational and well-grounded decision whether to come back home, where to find a job, and so on and so forth. And at the end, we're going to talk about the potential challenges after easing the lockdown. At the time of writing the brief that was mentioned, we spotted the challenges on the basis of those measures that were adopted at that time. Now we're gonna, and we can look a little bit further, considering that the countries in focus here are the easing lockdowns, and some countries even lifted the lockdown, and there is now the transition period for them. So all the lessons from these countries might be also adapted and considered, at least by other countries as well. So though we focus on 4 countries, I will tell right now which countries. It doesn't mean that those best practices cannot be distributed to other ones. So we're gonna focus on 4 countries. It's Poland, Italy, Czech Republic, and Hungary. And this is mainly because these are the main destinations for Ukrainian labor migrants in the European Union. And as you can see from the data from the Eurostat and on this graph and the state statistics service survey, it clearly shows that the Poland is basically the major destination and has the highest numbers considering all the other countries, and then a little bit less in Italy, a little bit less in Czechia, and even less in Hungary. So these are the countries of our focus for today. And now I can give the mic to my colleague, Pavlo Kravchuk.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank you for taking your time for this extremely important, to my mind, topic. And I would like to underline one more time why we are focusing on Ukrainian labor migration and on its significance for the whole Europe. Not all of its effects are measurable, and unfortunately we have a strong demand and a strong lack of some statistics of research of the Ukrainian labor migration effects, of its size, of numbers. But still we have some effects measured, and we can tell that definitely Ukrainian labor migration is providing workforce supply for the countries that feel the lack of working force in some fields, and we can measure the economic impact of Ukrainian labor migration to Poland's economy. You can see its contribution to the gross domestic product growth and to Ukrainian economy. Especially in 2019, the remittances of labor migrants were over 7% of the gross domestic product. And on the next slide, we can see how the pandemics started. It illustrates the suddenness and the abruptness of the situation that was faced by Ukrainian labor migrants in the countries in focus. As we all know, Italy was the first in Europe to face the severe restrictions, but actually in just one decade in March, almost all Europe went to lockdown, and thousands of people found themselves stuck in their host countries, found themselves locked. Many of them have lost the job, many of them have their documents expired or were going to be expired. So it was one of the main factors that impacted the situation of Ukrainian labor migrants in these countries. Currently, as Ruslan have already mentioned, we observe the serious easings of lockdowns in all countries, but still I would like to accent that we have no, actually we cannot tell how the situation will develop in the next months, and if there will be the second wave of the pandemic, or if there will be necessity to return these restrictions, and how the situation will develop. And actually what we would like to present today is a modeling of some future scenarios of some issues that will be raised by the further development of the situation. So please, next slide. Thank you. As Ruslan mentioned, one of the first challenges that was faced by Ukrainian labor migrants was their return. After almost all countries in Europe have suddenly locked their borders, many of countries have suspended the public transport. In particular, Ukraine has suspended all international regular passenger transport, including buses, trains, and flights. So labor migrants, there are some issues with translation. We can see in chat. Is it okay? May I continue?
Yes, sure. Please continue.
Okay. The first thing was transport. We infiltrated in some social media groups of Ukrainians abroad, and we observed the very high demand for people were struggling just to find a way to return home. They were trying to find some cars to join someone's journey. They were ready to pay very big money as for Ukrainian labor migrants, just to have a chance to return home. The second big challenge was queues on the border. As Ukraine has closed its borders, almost all border crossing points in the mid-March. And for example, on the Polish border, only 2 were functioning as of that time. And people were desperately trying to return home. So we have found ourselves in the situation when a lot of people simultaneously arrived to the border, and many of these people had no cars. They arrived by buses or other kinds of transport, and Ukraine also suspended the pedestrian crossing. So on the next slide, we can see one of the effects of this situation. When on March 27, thousands of Ukrainians gathered at the Kharkiv border crossing points, you can see that it was it has nothing to do with the security, with epidemic security, with protection, with social distancing. It was just a big gathering that was that should be managed in terms of crisis management, actually. And the next challenge is, sorry, could you return please one slide back and one slide back more? All the situations have caused the appearance of illegal transport schemes on border. As I have already mentioned, a lot of people have been returning home by arriving to the border, and they should cross somehow the border. Considering the situation that pedestrian crossing was suspended, they should found some other transport. It can be car, for example, someone's car who is riding it, or there suddenly appeared some buses of unknown origin that were transporting people through the border control only. It's like 500 meters of distance, and that were taking quite a big sum of money for these from people. And actually no one knows who are those people who are driving these buses, who are receiving the income from this situation. So, and the last challenge that is still actual is the overstay penalization on the border, and we will return to it later. It's, as we all know, currently most of states, actually all considered states, have legalized the stay of Ukrainian, and not only Ukrainian, labor migrants who have their documents expired. So can you please return to the legalization of stay? But still, Ukrainian labor migrants face a situation when their stay with expired documents is legalized in, for example, Italy or Czech Republic, but when returning home to Ukraine, they are penalized on the border. Actually, considering the data we have, it happens mostly on Hungarian border when exiting the European Union. But I suggest that probably in other countries the situation can be the same, and we should consider the possibility to better communication between European countries regarding the prolongation of residence permits, visas, and other documents on the period of pandemic. So almost all European countries have legalized stay of migrants and foreigners who have their documents expired, but there was, I would say, a certain sequence of priorities. First, the resident permits owners and the visa owners were in the focus of this legalization. And for example, people who entered visa-free in Poland, people who entered Poland visa-free and have their term of stay expired, they were how to say, they were a little, their situation was considered a little bit earlier by the government. And the last thing, irregular stay, I think Ruslan will talk more about it later, because this category of foreigners was also considered by Italian government. Next slide, please. Returning to the topic of overstay penalization when leaving the European Union, I would like to draw attention to the good practice that was introduced in Czechia on 4th of May. When leaving the Czech Republic, foreigners may ask the police officer to put a special stamp in their passport that confirms that their overstay in the Czech Republic was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So on the next slide, we can see the example of this stamp that was put to the passport of Ukrainian citizen. And considering the situation, this is quite a good practice because we have numerous messages from Ukrainian citizens regarding who were penalized, who were obliged to pay some fines because of their overstay, which was not voluntary at all. And even now, when the situation has eased, these complaints still are present in these social media groups we observe. So next, please, and the next, please. Returning to labor market development, I would like to highlight the fact that pandemic has shown the specific vulnerabilities of labor migrants. I mean, when the pandemic has come and restriction has come to effect, a lot of businesses were closed, a lot of many people have lost their working places, and in this situation, labor migrants who are much less flexible in changing their job than the natives, they faced especially strong challenge. For example, in most countries in focus, people with working permits should have, if their working permit is tied to a specific company or a specific employer, and this is why they have to, if they change the job, they have to provide, they have to apply for an alternative work permit. The only exception is here is Italy, that allows to change job and to seek for a new job for a period after a year. Also, we found an interesting and in some way paradoxical situation in Poland, because people hired by temporary working agencies who were considered to be in precarious situation all the time before the pandemic, they after the pandemic starts, suddenly they found themselves in better positions than many others employees, because formally they are working for the temporary work agency, not the specific company, and it allowed them to simply change their workplace, and therefore they became better protected. Well, and now situation seems to become better. The situation seems to improve. All countries considered easing their restrictions. For example, in Ukraine, we have now the public and international transport resumed. Poland yesterday has introduced some easings. Still, I think that even if we not face the second wave of the pandemic, we have to consider some specific facts regarding the future of the world and the future of labor migration in Europe after the pandemic ends. Firstly, one of the biggest problems that for Ukrainian labor migrants is now how to leave Ukraine, actually. on the beginning of the pandemic, it was how to return. Now it's how to live, because transport is still not accessible to all. And for example, we had a number of stories when European countries that had a very strong demand for seasonal workers were trying to organize charter flights for Ukrainian workers to bring them to the host countries, but in Ukraine it was these charter flights faced a lot of restrictions, bureaucratic procedures, some untransparent procedures, I would say, and it caused quite a lot of problems. And the situation, for example, with workers who were about to leave Ukraine to work in Britain, all these people arrived to the airport, and suddenly the flight was suspended by the state aviation service. And only after long negotiations on the governmental level, this flight was allowed. Second issue is the future of the short-term circular migration, which is one of the actually a large share of Ukrainian migrants, especially in the ones who arrive to Poland, are short-term circular migrants who work for up to 90 or for up to 180 days and then return home. Also, a large share of borderland residents are working in Poland or other countries, Hungary, Slovakia, in the mode of, for example, 5-day working and back to the weekend. And in the situation of widespread of COVID-19, and if it stays as dangerous as now it is, the logic or the necessity and the possibility of this intensive short-term travels between countries is doubtful a bit, and quite probably that it will lead to change in the character of migration. So the long-term migration will become more popular and more accessible. And another one thing, which is actually mostly for Poland, is the perspective of migration authorities overload after the easing the lockdown. As we know, in Poland, so-called Tarcza antykryzysowa, the anti-crisis shield, it's a set of laws designed to respond to the pandemic. It allowed foreigners who have their documents and stay expired to stay in Poland up to 30 days after the end of lockdown. So considering this situation, it may lead to a situation when all labor migrants who have their documents expired, and there is quite a large number of them in Poland, they may simultaneously go to local migration authorities to prolong their documents or to apply for a new one, and so on. And even before the pandemic, actually local authorities were quite overloaded by the applications for work permits and for residence permits, and waiting for issuing the one could could last for up to 1 year, speaking about long-term residence permits. So these are three possible challenges that may come in after easing the lockdown. But even anyway, even if the pandemic do not even if the pandemic do not comes into force, even if there is no second wave of COVID-19, we would like the governments and the responsible authorities to consider some lessons maybe of the current pandemic. Firstly, it's about the bilateral and multilateral cooperation. And the most bright example is actually this issue of penalization on the border when people who, for example, overstayed in Czech Republic or in Italy are penalized on the Hungarian border, because we have this specific European Union situation when all considered countries are under one umbrella of Schengen acquis, but at the same time, each one has its own national system and its own national legislation, and the involuntary overstay in Italy becomes not to say crime, but a violation of the rules in Hungary. Probably the authorities and the governments of these countries should communicate better. The second thing is the necessity in statistics, in observing, in research on the topic of Ukrainian labor migration. I don't think it would be a surprise for the audience, but even the number, for example, of Ukrainian labor migrants is unknown, the exact number. I mean, and it's becomes an object of various numerous speculations of political manipulations and so on. But people like, for example, Asper Ruslan, who come to some study, they actually, we had a very little data when we were preparing this study, and we should draw our attention to newspaper publications, to social media groups, to personal interviews, and so on. I think that more statistics and more research on more data exchange on governmental level is definitely needed. And the other thing is necessity to bring services into online, and it may be one of the responses to the case of migration authorities overload. That will also help to avoid the unnecessary contacts between people and preserving social distance and so on. And on this level, I would like to stop and to bring back Ruslan.
Thank you, Pavlo. I would like to continue with the case of seasonal workers, because every country, not only your country, but many countries in the world, they recognized food supply workers and seasonal workers as the essential for countries' economies, because this is the food supply and security of the countries. And European Commission even allowed for seasonal workers from third countries to enter the European Union. In this case, here we would like to focus on Ukrainian seasonal workers in Poland, because from the numbers, as you can see, the greatest number of Ukrainian seasonal workers, they are actually in Poland. According to Eurostat, 45,000 in 2018. This is much more than in the second country, that is Bulgaria, almost 700 people. But not only Poland is important for Ukrainians, it's also the Ukrainians that are important, because on the second graph, as you can see, almost 99% of all seasonal workers here are actually Ukrainians. And right now from the graph, you see the popular months that are May, June, July. So the need for them is already happening. And there are two ways for them to enter Poland. They can enter with visa and work permit already in hand, or they can enter visa-free for quite some time, and we wrote it in the brief. There was actually the issue that visa-free was not allowed by Poland. Right now, the situation is different. Right now, visa-free seasonal workers can also enter Poland, so this problem is no longer present. And in general, on our opinion, is that the Polish case is kind of a best practice for other countries dealing with seasonal workers, because they can enter, they can stay, even if the documents expire. So this the situation with their regularization was fixed. Then there is the case of quarantine. That was among the hardest, because to stay 14 days in quarantine when you come from Ukraine to Poland, and you stay in Poland only 3 months, for instance, and your aim is to earn as much money as you can. Of course, this affected even the desire for some seasonal workers to go to Poland. But this situation is resolved right now. For the authorities in Poland, they allow for workers to work this 14 days in the farm where they work, but they cannot go outside from that circle, so they not contaminate other people in case if they may catch some COVID-19. So they undergo the quarantine for 14 days, but they are working at the same time in the fields during these days. Also, the logistics is now a bit easier. More border posts are open. There are more transport as it was at the beginning of the lockdown. But still, of course, the logistic is still probably the main issue for now. It's, of course, harder than before the lockdowns, but the situation is improving. Also, it's easy even to get the documents, because the Polish visa centers and consular workers are open right now, even in Ukraine, specifically targeting the seasonal workers. So this is the least, I would say, the least issue with the seasonal workers, considering all labor migrant group that we have now. Another group that I want to consider right now is the domestic workers in Italy. Why we selected them? Because among the labor migrants, Ukrainian labor migrants here, this group is the biggest one. It is represented mainly by female. About 20% of them are in Lombardia, the region that was most hit by the COVID-19 in Italy. And according to the Italian statistics, the earliest was for 2017. You can see that 62% are occupied in public, seasonal, and personal services, meaning actually that they are domestic workers. Those are the housekeepers, the caregivers, and the babysitters, all three categories. And if, for instance, the situation with caregivers it might be a bit easier, because they usually live with the employers in the same apartment or house. The situation with babysitters and housekeepers is a bit different, because people were stuck at home, and for them, maybe they don't need any more housekeepers or babysitters. In the brief, we outlined some issues that make the life of these people really unbearable during the time of the COVID-19. Now it is easier. The situation improved mostly the last few weeks, actually. And the first improvement is that for the first time, the domestic workers, including Ukrainians, they can receive the targeted pecuniary state help that was not present before. Before, state help for self-employed, for workers in entertainment industry, seasonal even workers, but not for domestic workers. After a few weeks ago, they adopted that the domestic workers can also get the €500 bonus for April and May. Of course, the situation was easing the lockdowns. The fact that from 18th of May, there is no more need for self-declarations and checks on the streets improved the situation, especially for irregular workers, because before that, when you exit your home, you should have the paper self-declaration saying where you go, from which point to which point, why you go. And the police could also ask you the ID. Of course, if you are irregular, if you show your ID, it's you don't have any legal rights to stay there. You can be deported, not during the COVID probably, but later. So some people couldn't even go outside to the supermarket. They asked their neighbors, for instance, but that's not the solution for the time now. This issue is, of course, easier. Another thing is the so-called bonus pesa. This is the vouchers that people can take and buy some food, some hygienic products in the supermarket for them. And a few weeks ago, the court in Rome decided that the residence should not be the prerequisite for that, because many irregular migrants, they do not have the residence, they could not demonstrate that, and so they couldn't get the bonus pesa, this vouchers. Now the court decided and they can. And of course, the issue with irregular migrants is also easier now because of what Paulo said, so-called migration amnesty or sanatoria. In Italy, the last time it was done in 2012. Now they also adopted the way to regularize irregular workers. So their legal status and the access to the state help might be better. And why it's important? Because according to Italian Statistic Institute, again 2017, the latest data that we found, about half of all domestic workers were irregular. So they are not only Ukrainian. So this is data about all domestic workers, but that is quite an impressive number. And I think that after these measures, the situation is better, comparable, if we compare to the situation just about a few weeks ago, a month ago. So it is improving. Still remain some weak points that were not fixed yet. Even though domestic workers are considered as essential for the country's economy, they were not among the groups that could not be dismissed. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Italian government adopted the law that actually banned to dismiss the employers for many industries, but domestic workers were not among these people. So they ended up in a situation when, even though they are essential, they can be easily fired. Fortunately, according to the interviews that we conducted with people, with Ukrainian labor migrants in Italy, nobody lost their job. Even in some cases, there were more work to do, and they get some, well, it's not money, not the salary increase, but some premiums they get for working more hours. But that, of course, depends on the industry. That was the logistics, for instance. So they didn't lose their job, but still. So more protection, I would say, more protection would be desirable in the situation of those category of people, of domestic workers in Italy. And the last but not least, I think this is a really important issue, is the information provision. Why it's important? Because the situation develops really quickly. The laws changes every week, basically, and to keep up with all those updates for ordinary people is not that easy. But it's important for them to know and to make the decision to stay in the host country or to leave the host country, to change the job or not, what to do. So to make the well-grounded choice, they must have all the information. And that was not always easy. We have diplomatic missions and consular missions in all the host countries. And for instance, in case of Italy and Hungary, of course, people, the Ukrainians, could reach them via messengers, phone calls, write emails as usually. But the countries like Czech Republic and Poland, they were much more active in providing the information in the language of these people, in Ukrainian, of course, language. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs had a really good initiative called the Protection, but different embassies implemented them in different ways. For instance, Hungary and Italy, they created the group protection in Facebook, and people were writing different things about how to get back home, about the legalization, but mainly the presence of ministry was not very big. In case of Czech Republic and Poland, for instance, they created the Google form even where people can ask the questions about the legalization of stay in case of expired documents, about the return options, about even about the work of supermarkets, chemists, and hospitals. In case of Czech Republic, for instance, there was also a possibility to ask, I lost the job, what can I do? There were also on the web pages and on the social media the frequently asked question option. This is also good for the representatives of consular services because they should not answer the same questions all the time. People can book on the web pages and find the detailed explanation in Ukrainian, and this is the case also for Poland and Czech Republic. And of course, social media, they were actively present there. But of course, there is always room for improvement. I would suggest, for instance, to introduce also the chatbots for the consular services to answer the question and to decrease the overload of questions for the employers of consular services themselves. And this practice is already present in the foreign ministry. They provide the possibility for chatbots for foreigners who want to enter Ukraine and get the documents. So this technology, if I can say, is already present, and it can be also tailored for the needs of not only labor migrants, but in general Ukrainians who are stuck abroad. And of course, the language. And here I would like to talk more about the host country authorities. For short-term migrants, this is of course the issue. The majority of people have no or very restricted knowledge of the host country language. But also for the country like Italy, where the majority of people are long-term migrants and they actually speak Italian in private, the majority of them, and almost all of them at work, still according to the surveys, about 70% people say that they face some difficulties. So more information, even by the host country authorities in the native language of the group that has a big presence in the country of labor migrants, would be a good policy. And this is the case for Poland, for instance, and Czech Republic. They provide the information about the new rules for foreigners, also in Ukrainian, also other languages like Russian, English, and other languages. But it is present also in Ukraine. And this is, of course, important for people to make the right decision. and this decision affects what is going on the ground and the crowds on the border posts, because often, especially at the beginning of the lockdown, the reaction was a bit not adequate, in a sense that the people were not just, they were not aware about the options that they have, about the fact that the documents that expired can be considered, they can continue their legal stay despite this fact. Some people just didn't know, and those people, for instance, who came back from Poland, many of them said that they came back because their documents expired. They came back to renew the documents, and now they come back to Poland after the consular services opened, and they renewed the documents. But they could stay there and find the job there, and continue to earn some money. That's the main aim why they go there, right? So yes, I think I should stop here, and if you have questions and answers, we are ready to answer. I give the floor to Irina, the moderator on the stage.
Thank you very much, Ruslan, and thank you very much, Pavlo. Before handing over to Irina, I Googled a bit during your presentation, so just to update participants on the situation in Ukraine. There are currently 22,382 infected by COVID and 669 fatalities. If I have the right information, the quarantine regime is still in place until the 22nd of June, with some lifting of restrictions taking place, and the borders are closed, as you mentioned also during your presentations, also of the EU neighbors, as well as Russia, I think. So indeed, the labor migrants who returned back to Ukraine are currently in Ukraine. So that leads us to my question. I make use of this privilege that I can ask the first question. If all the migrants that are currently in Ukraine leave the country, and we don't know what will be after the COVID pandemics, will not Ukraine be short of labor force on its own? Who will be working in Ukraine when everybody moves abroad? So is there any governmental program being considered that would motivate labor migrants to stay in Ukraine and work in a local labor market rather than moving abroad? Thank you. And after your answer, please, Irina will follow up with raising the questions brought up by through the chat. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe I will start. Okay. Well, speaking about the shortage of labor force in Ukraine, it is a high risk which our country faces for a long time. But at the same time, we have some quite strong disproportion in the country, because we, even in, for example, 2019, when we had over 1 million or probably 2 million of labor migrants who left the country, we had at the same time unemployment at approximately 9%. And in different regions, the situation of the labor market was different, because as well as in different sectors of labor market. And for example, it was hard to find some construction workers or some farming machines operators and so on, but at the same time we had an unemployment of 9%. So the risk of labor shortage, of course, exists, but I think that better designed policy of, for example, internal mobility and mobility between labor market circuits could help this. And answering the question about the governmental programs, we have some legislation adopted during the last 5 years. For example, the law on reintegration of the law on external labor migration that considers the issue of reintegration of labor migrants. And for example, during last year, Ukrainian government proposed the program of loans under 5, 7 or 9% yearly that was considered to help the situation. Still, I have no data that could help assess if this was effective or not.
Yes, I would just add that of course we have some programs right now, and that was proclaimed by the new government that its aim is to make those labor migrants that are abroad to come back home and work here. And they, as Pavlo said, they introduced some programs, or as a loan program, for instance. Yes, it is present, but from what I heard from those labor migrants that came here, especially during the pandemic, Ukraine is not the exception. The unemployment is increased. To find a new job is not that easy. And also, if you compare salaries in Ukraine, salaries in European Union, they are different. And those people that come as especially short-term migrants, as still circular workers, as they come for 3 months with visa free, they come back with stay 3 months here and come back there again for 3 months. So they are circulating, and they say that they earn much more than they can earn here in Ukraine. And even during the pandemic and the lockdown, in social media, I saw a lot of announcements by the people that how can I get back to Italy. Also the proposal from the different drivers that we are going, who wants, and this is the price. And people during the pandemic were trying to go back there. So also coming back here, they increase the unemployment rates here. Also, if they are not working there, as Pavlo said, the remittances was really a high percentage of the Ukrainian GDP. So I don't see anything like, of course, there are some negative aspects. Of course, there is a social influence, the influence of the family, the fact that they are not contributing to the Ukrainian economy. But in this case, I think that this is their choice. If they can find the job here and work here for the salary that they consider as good for them, they have this option. If they think that they're abroad, they can earn more money. That is the choice that they should make, not the government should make. So.
Thank
Human
you.
rights.
Irina, please go ahead with the questions.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Very nice to have still quite some participants on board by the Q&A session. So Ruslan, Pavlo, thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to start with a question that comes the last, actually, from our big friend, Agnieszka Kulesa. And she says that the estimates say that Ukraine may lose up to $4 billion in remittances due to the COVID pandemic. What are your estimates how that may affect and could affect social and economic landscape in Ukraine?
Well, I'm not economist to start from this, and I cannot say about all the factors, and actually I do not even how the National Bank of Ukraine estimated this 12 billion number. Still, the one fact is widely known is that these remittances contributed to the stability of valued exchange rate in Ukraine, the stability of Ukrainian currency. So probably it may affect that value.
I would add that yes, we are not economists and we didn't estimate the numbers. So I think that we can just believe that number. And it does make sense considering, the fact that the unemployment is rising everywhere. And of course, for migrants to find a job abroad would be harder. The money that they can transfer will be, of course, harder as well. So it's really nothing surprising that we expect the lower remittances, and also even though the lockdown is eased right now, still it's hard to go to the country, to the EU country, and to find a job if you are not a seasonal workers, and not everyone is seasonal or domestic workers. So I think that yeah, this prognosis does make really sense.
And probably I can add one more thing about this, not my field of expertise. When Ukraine faced a very severe crisis in 2014, I've met some very interesting opinions regarding the fact that one of the things that saved the economy at that time was a large share of black and gray economy sectors of economy, because they provide some security and insurance, these sectors that are not counted by official statistics. So probably we can hope to some help from these gray and black sectors.
This is quite interesting what you mentioned, that a shadow economy may have a positive effect, that the national authorities sometimes underestimate it also. So the next question that comes from Belarus, if I am not mistaken, do you know whether there is any research that is undertaken by the state authorities of Ukraine with regard to the influence or the impact of the pandemic on the labor migration in Ukraine? So the national authorities and their research, have there been done anything in this regard?
On the labor migration, I haven't seen, but I have seen in general the impact on the economy. There were estimations about, for instance, how much the lockdown cost, what is the lockdown cost for the economy, and what would be the cost for the economy if there were no lockdown. This kind of estimations made by the Kyiv School of Economics, for instance, and they made about economy. They made a lot of estimations, but about labor, specifically targeting labor migrants, maybe Pavlosin, I haven't.
No, I would add that in Ukraine, the situation with statistics regarding labor migration is very poor in general since forever, I would say, because actually in legislation it is provisioned that the government should provide some research, should keep statistical data up to date, but in fact what the government operates now is the expert estimations or the survey that was used by us, the survey of 2017. Actually, and it's definitely already not very up to date. But also it's a problem not only of Ukrainian government. There is a need of research and statistical data that should be as up to date as possible.
That is very true. I think that the same challenge exists in many countries, if not most of the countries, with regard to statistics and the data. There was one clarification question coming from Martin Hoffman. You mentioned a 62% share of domestic workers for Italy. Can you clarify again, what does it refer to? The 62% share.
This means that the 62% of Ukrainian labor migrants in Italy, they work in the public, social, and personal services, according to the 2017 data. This was the aim was to show that to show the selection of the domestic workers, why we consider them, because Ukrainian labor migrants mostly work in this field. 62% of them work as domestic workers. These are babysitters, housekeepers, and caregivers.
All right, thank you. Then there is a question with regard to the shifting between the sectors. Coming from Anastasia, she asks whether Ukrainian labor migrants who are present in Poland have been shifting between the service sector to any other sectors in March and April during the pandemic. Do you know anything about that?
I've seen this survey by the EWL. This is the recruitment agency in Poland. And according to this survey, it was, I think, about 20 or 21% of Ukrainians, they changed the job. So that means that they shifted. I don't know if they shifted the sector, but they changed the job.
But I think we should consider that it was survey via internet with quite a low number of participants. It was 100 or something like that. But in the absence, in the situation of absence of data, yes, it's something at least.
Exactly, you can get at least something. So another question comes from Georgi. He asks about the temporary employment services in Poland that you mentioned during the presentation. Has the specific national authority or agency that you were referring to set up any measures to promote employment of migrants? And does this national authority itself, employer, assist migrants in finding a job? If you recall mentioning that during your presentation.
Yeah. The focus of this mention was to show the situation of this change, because the temporary employment agencies, they exist quite for a long time, and before pandemic they were considered, not to say gray sector of economy, but
playing with the law.
Yes, playing with the law. Formally everything is okay, but some issues regarding social protection and so on are doubtful. And in the situation of crisis, again, this precarious situation turned to become more protected. Speaking about Ukrainian or not Ukrainian labor migrants. So speaking about specific measures by governments to help employment of labor migrants, I cannot recall the ones except for probably the situation with seasonal workers in Italy that Ruslan mentioned about employing irregular migrants.
Okay.
I would like to add to this that the case of the temporary agencies in Poland and the case of in Italy, where you can change your employer without the need to change the documents. In Italy, everything is legal. In Poland, formally it's legal, formally. Shows how important at this kind of situation is to have the flexible rules, because in other cases the worker is tied to a particular position, a particular employer, and the flexibility is practically absent in those cases. But for this kind of situations, this flexibility is actually what could ease could be beneficial for both, for workers, because he doesn't need to care about all this additional bureaucracy, which is harder at those times, and also for the offices, governmental offices, because they have the less overload on them, and they can respond more efficient. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Pavlo, Ruslan. So we're going to the next question. I'd like to raise this one about the perception on migrants. Did Ukrainian migrants experience more xenophobia in receiving countries, or vice versa, more appreciation towards them and their work that they do? And how were returning migrants viewed by the nationals in Ukraine?
Well, starting from Ukraine's estimations, they are quite, there's a big range of assessments, of opinions, and of course, there are some that could be observed in the media and in social media, especially, that were actually some hate speech, like why do you return here, people? You left your country, stay where you left, and please do not bring us this terrible virus to our country, something like that. But still, I would not say it's very widespread opinion, but it definitely exists, and it was refueled by the pandemic situation. But I do not know about surveys or other opinion polls or something like that regarding attitude to people, to labor migrants in Ukraine. But in 2018, in 2019, there were some opinion polls nationwide in Ukraine that showed very vividly that Ukrainians consider labor migration the biggest threat that for the national, for the country and for the economy, for security, for national security, yes. That is even bigger than the war or the poverty. And it's something amazing, and I think it's a bit disproportional.
I would add, of course, I haven't seen the polls as well, but from what the media says and what some experts says, is that the perception of labor migrants abroad seems to be improved, especially those that are essential workers. They need them, they understand that they need them, and they, well, I couldn't say that they appreciate them as much as the health care workers, but they understand the importance of the food supply and the importance of seasonal workers, especially seasonal workers for harvesting. So in this case, I think that the perception abroad could be a bit improving. In case of those migrants that came back here in Ukraine, from what I see on the Ukrainian TV is they're reporting about, for instance, the quarantine violations by the migrants, that they do not respect rules, like this kind of things. That's why, well, maybe in Ukraine it's at least not improving, but yeah, of course, this is not the social representative survey, but some, I would say, proxy that could indicate some public mood maybe regarding this issue.
All right, then we go to the next question. There was a very general question with regard to the methodology of your policy brief that you produced. In particular, how was evidence at the border and in destination countries collected? Could you clarify that? Thank you.
What do you mean by evidence?
How did you work on your policy brief? How did you collect your data? Was it only the desk research, or I remember that you actually did a few interviews. Maybe you could just elaborate on that.
Okay, yes. So first of all, as Paolo mentioned, there is no data at this point, and especially at the time of writing, there. As you know, the state offices and authorities, they are slow in publishing even the data that could be used. So it was not absent. That's why we decided to, first of all, do desk research, considering different policies, rules that were present at that time, and from that affecting the possible influence, knowing the data from previous years, right? How many migrants are, what they want, what they need. So we consider first this formal like rules and how they potential to affect. Then, of course, we were trying to see what polls are present, and they were very little. That's why we conducted our own research and trying to get some data on our own. So we contacted the Ukrainian consular and embassy presence to get the data about the protection, for instance, this service, what people asked them, what questions were the most common, and we presented those data in the paper as well. Then, of course, we also interviewed some labor migrants. If this is totally qualitative and not representative, but at least we could feel how is that to be there at this time, because you cannot travel and look yourself, right? So we were interviewing people from the countries. We are interviewing experts as well, like Olena Babakova, for instance, from Poland. And we also were monitoring the social media groups for labor migrants in those countries, Italy, Czechia, Poland, and Hungary. Because a lot of issues you can spot actually there. Everybody is locked at home, so this is the way they communicate, and they discover the information, they share their problems, they share what they need. So the social media in this case was selected as a tool. And this is not, of course, this is not a social survey or sociological study. Our aim was to spot the issues and to find the solutions in order to provide some policy ideas how to tailor better the policy, the lockdowns, in order to make the life of labor migrants easier. And I think that the swift analysis at this point was important for the governments. Of course, later on, when the statistics will be published, more thorough and more representative studies can be done, and of course they will be done. They will be welcome.
Thank you, Ruslan. Yeah, maybe Pavlo has a
small. One more thing is that we have one type of data which is quite easily accessible and is quite up to date. It's the data on border crossing. It was provided by State Border Guard Service of Ukraine almost daily in the end of March and beginning of April. And using this data, we could make some conclusions also. For example, we could see that, not to say for the first time in history, but for the first time in the last 15 years, we had a positive saldo of entry-exit in Ukraine. More people returned than left. While in the previous 15 years, yearly, it always were more people leaving than returning.
Okay, so the trend basically. There is a question from Yelena Sadovskaya. Are there any legal initiatives for regularization of the irregular migrants, Ukrainian and from other countries, envisaged in the destination countries as a long-term solution? Would you know anything on that? For example, in the 4 EU member states that you were focusing on?
I mentioned Italy, the sanatoria. It's already passed and in force law. So it depends. There are envisioned different procedures, whether it's employer or employee. But this is not the first time. It was done in 2012. Now 2020. So they have kind of history and experience doing that. Labor migrants, Ukrainian, not only Ukrainian, but also Ukrainian, will be regularized. The program is specifically targeting domestic workers among other groups. There are also seasonal workers and workers in fisheries. So Italy is doing this. About Poland, Hungary, well, with Hungary, there is a particular situation with issuing passports for Ukrainians that is not recognized by Ukraine. So there is a different situation, and it's not related to the COVID at all. Czech Republic and Poland, we actually didn't track these countries because the possibilities to have the long-term regularization, because usually the migration is predominantly short-term and circular, and people they aim is not to stay there. They just, of course, according to the surveys of Poland, for instance, more people want to stay there, but they have other options doing that. So Poland is not making any special rules like Italy, for instance, to regularize irregular workers, because it's not an issue, it's not an agenda. This was on agenda in Italy because there are people, there are Ukrainian migrants that are long term, and a lot of them are irregular. So this was the issue. This is not the issue for other three countries. That's why we didn't go deep into this point.
I would like to add regarding Ukraine, because we have an adopted strategy of national migration policy, and by year 2025, and it provisions the considering of the issue of migration amnesty, so-called, but it is not included into the current plan of implementation. So actually, this issue is postponed to the indefinite future. But still, it is on the agenda because we have in Ukraine a number of foreigners who are actually illegally present, but who are, for example, due to some reasons, cannot be returned. For example, because there is an ongoing conflict in the origin country and so on. And one more thing I would like to add that is somewhat closely related to this topic is that there are some Ukrainians who are illegally present, who illegally stay in the territory of European Union, and the number of detections during last years rises each year to approximately 10-20% in this range. Most of them are detected in Poland, but not only, and so I think that, well, Ukraine as a state and the interest of Ukrainian citizens requires probably some, I don't know, for example, some interest from the Ukrainian government in this issue, so that Ukrainians who are illegally present in some European Union states, that they had chance to make their stay regular, make it according to the law.
I'd like to add also that the issue, as Paulo said, of the migration amnesty in Ukraine is really considered, and there is no, the agreement among the experts. It's kind of controversial issue for Ukraine, and it was also controversial for Italy. There were a lot of articles and discussion in the society whether to do that or not, and there are pros and cons to discuss. Of course, there are cons also for the country, because the aim is to usually to reward the legal migration and to punish the illegal migration. So yes, of course, this issue is not easy for the country, and this should be considered as well.
Okay, thank you. We have an interesting question. I'm not sure you will be able to answer to that, but still, because it somehow is linked to what you just replied to, whether there is any possibility to identify a case when a person actually overstayed the situation because of the COVID-19 and not for other reasons. Do you think that there is anything like that the countries can do? For instance, the stamps that you referred to in Czechia, whether the bodyguards were actually able to identify that this person not violated the stay period before the COVID?
Yes, I think that the government actually envisioned this possibility. They in the documents they said that the documents should expire after the lockdown started, and I think that this is the measure that one of the measures. Probably there are other one that can be considered, and yeah, and if you if it started much before and you stayed illegally there, so of course it's not because of the COVID, it's because of other reasons.
Definitely.
Okay, we have a question with regard to cooperation. What do you think, whether there is any possible cooperation between the sending countries and receiving countries, in this case, particularly between Ukraine and Poland, for instance, that received the lion's share of Ukrainian labor migrants, that could be considered, and what kind of cooperation would be important in your opinion?
The first thing that comes into my head is cooperation on data on the migration flows tracking, because it's really the big issue, and I do not understand how can the evidence-based policy be designed without evidence, without data. There should be something, I don't know, some probably data exchange system or common statistics service, or probably cooperation between statistics services of Ukraine and the European Union, between the ministries of interior, between the migration services. Just for example, to count people, how many of them are leaving, how many of them are returning.
And I think that also in the field of logistics, the cooperation could be beneficial for both countries in terms of streamlining the process of moving people from the one country to the another country.
It's quite difficult to talk about the numbers, and we received a few comments from Vladimir Yurchenko, and he mentioned that it's not frankly correct to compare the number of irregular migrants without comparing to the number of the people who are coming when it comes to their citizens of Ukraine, and that the challenge with regard to statistics and counting the number of labor migrants exists in all the countries, because people usually, when they leave their country of origin, they do not specify that they leave for labor purposes. Most often they specify a different reason. So yeah, of course, Vladimir, thank you for this comment. We know about that, and I'm sure that Pavlo and Ruslan are aware of that. I have a couple of questions that come from Dmitry Poletaev. They're in Russian. I'll try to translate the first way right away. Other estimates, I know that you're not economist, but yeah, exactly. You're not economist, but maybe you know, are there any estimates how the remittances of those labor migrants, of Ukrainian labor migrants, go to open any business in Ukraine, or maybe in any other way? Do you know how they're spent, how remittances of labor migrants are spent in Ukraine? Sorry, I have a little church.
Okay, actually, there are some like flowing opinions, and probably we can find some research, but I cannot speak of numbers now. The only thing I can tell is that it is traditionally considered that Ukrainian labor migrants and their families spend firstly on consuming, like daily consuming, and investing in things like building a new house or buying an apartment or something like that. and also sometimes to children's education, healthcare, and so on. And the business, starting new businesses, very small share.
And actually, when we conducted the qualitative semi-structured interviews in the Polish-Ukrainian borderland, we were talking with actually a lot of people and all the stakeholders, and the majority view was that they are not investing in business and not investing. they are consuming, and I don't think that this changed. To invest and to open business, it's not only the money that you should have, right? It's also many factors effects, like the same as for foreign investors, like the transparent court system, the transparent and easy bureaucratic procedures, and all the other factors. Of course, we see the last years that in doing business, Ukraine is increasing and improving its position, but still a lot of work is remaining to do.
Not long ago, we communicated with representatives of IOM Ukraine. I don't know if they are here now, but they have quite interesting projects that probably could be implemented in our country. It's like the added value scheme, when each dollar invested by labor migrants brings, for example, $1 or $2 from some donor, for example, International Organization for Migration, or from government or something like that. So, for example, investing $1,000, you get 1,000 more to develop your business, and probably it could be more effective than the proposed by Ukrainian government program of loans, which was launched not long ago. Actually, it was announced as loans for labor migrants who can take some money under quite low percent, like 5 or 7% yearly.
All right, thank you. I think that you pretty much answered this question. And another one that comes also from Dmitry, he is interested with regard to the re-education of the youth that is becoming, that is actually going to the EU, whether Ukraine or whether there is any trend on re-education of those labor migrants that are exiting the country from, for instance, the higher education to their qualifications that are more in demand in the EU. Do you know anything about that?
What does it mean? I mean, people are leaving.
Exactly, obtaining the new qualifications that are more in demand in the EU, whether there is any trend like that. For instance, the person was receiving a high education, right now they are receiving a new qualification that are more in demand in the EU, that are...
Again, no data, but I think that yes, because I've heard of cases of people who like had one qualification, probably a teacher or engineer, and then they went to the EU and finished there some course of other specialization.
Would you say they downgrade or upgrade their education?
There are also cases of downgrading. In Italy, for instance, consider domestic workers. Don't you think that they have higher education? I think that they have, but they are working as domestic workers. But also, in case of upgrading, I think it also exists. I don't have the data, but for instance, the experts on Ukrainian migrants in Hungary, they say that some labor migrants that work there, they gain the skills of working on that particular factory, for instance, or making that car or something like that. And with those higher skills, they are looking for a job in some other countries. So they also are a bit afraid of losing the already educated in this country high-skilled workers, Ukrainian workers that continue to respond to higher salaries in other countries, let's say. So I think it works in both ways. But it's not when we talk about the education, I don't think that it's like, you know, formal education. It's that you gain the new skills on the job.
All right, thank you. Do you know whether there are any kind of national state initiatives that support this requalification of labor migrants, or that's individual choice of each particular labor migrant that we're talking?
Probably there are some local programs by State Employment Service, but I'm not sure. It should be back-checked. And also in the law on external labor migration, there is a provision that the state should facilitate the recognizing of qualifications obtained abroad. But as far as I know, it doesn't work at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was the last question. We have the last comment that comes from Czech Republic. Perhaps I just read it out loud and then I turn back to Radim. Andrei, he mentions that an update from Czechia, there is no regularization. All migrants with expired visas, residence permits, and with a free stay are allowed to stay until the 16th of July 2020. Thank you very much once again, Ruslan, Pavlo, Radim, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Irina, Ruslan, Pavlo, and all participants for your questions and for staying with us till the very end. This was the third webinar of the Prague process on the Ukrainian labor migrants in selected EU member states. Already now, I have the pleasure to invite you to next two webinars, one taking place on the 18th of June on assessing EU external migration policy by Krzysztof Tamás, and on 2nd of July, labor migration in Prague process region in COVID times by Mr. Andrea Salvini. The invitation will follow in due time. So now I would like to thank you again. And before leaving, please take a few minutes for a survey that will appear on the screen after I've said goodbye once again. So goodbye, and please fill in the evaluation. Thank you and see you next time.